Hi, this is Mrs. Brown from Research Triangle High School. The purpose of this presentation is to go over some of the aspects of life in the aristocracy during the Victorian times. And this will help you have a better understanding of some of the things that are happening in Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest. One of the first things that we see is this idea of someone coming to call. This is actually a calling card, and it's the equivalent of the modern day business cards. And this was very common for people to visit each other's houses, and if they weren't home, they would leave their card to say that they were there, or you might be at home and receive visitors that day. And it's how well-to-do people actually spent a lot of their time, was coming and going to each other's houses. Now, if you remember the upper class, you definitely had servants. The servants were supposed to be seen and not necessarily heard. And above all, you needed your servants to be loyal. The servants would be seeing every aspect of your lives. They would know exactly who came and went, how much money you were spending, what you ate or didn't eat, and they would help you get dressed in the morning, take care of all of your toilette as you got ready and prepared, and would certainly be there to hear all of your secrets. So having loyalty in your servants was a really important part of the life of the upper class. In addition to just making calls, you would also have people come for tea. Tea was a very formalized event. Tea would be served, but often other light drinks like lemonade of some kind, or even light alcohol such as sherry might be served during tea. And what was particularly known for were small finger sandwiches and other treats such as things like scones, which are these little biscuity type things, often served with jam and clotted cream. So tea was a very formal occasion with a lot of ritual attached to it. Hostesses would plan elaborate formal dinner parties. Now, these were parties where obviously dinner was the main thing, but a lot of it was also about conversation and exactly to whom you were seated next to, because that was the real key. They were almost always arranged with men and women sitting in order. So you would go female, male, female, male, and it was considered very bad manners to like put a husband and wife next to each other because they get to talk to each other all the time. The hostess and the host would sit at one end of the table, and very often, about halfway through the dinner, the hostess would do something called turning the table. So at the beginning of the dinner, you only talk to people on your left, for example, and then halfway through, the hostess would turn to the person on her other side, and that was a signal for everybody at the table to turn and talk to the other people next to them. So these were elaborately planned, very carefully put together, kind of like today if you do a wedding, you're very careful to see who's sat next to each other and who shouldn't be sat next to each other. So when in The Importance of Being Earnest, there's a moment where someone cancels a dinner that they had already accepted, and it's going to put the hostess completely out of sorts because she's going to have to rearrange her whole table. In an age obviously before television or movies, one of the biggest entertainments was also to invite people over for a musical evening. Now, all young women were expected to learn some sort of a musical talent. They might play an instrument or they might learn to sing, and people would invite them over to their salons, basically their formal, fancy living rooms, and sit around in the evening and be entertained by the talents, hopefully the talents, of their various guests. Members of the very wealthiest class during the Victorian times would have two houses. One would be their country home, which was often sort of their family estate that they had inherited for a very long, down through the generations. And this would be far away from the city, usually the city of London, and have lots of land attached to, and it's where they would spend most of the year. Then the rest of the year during the high season, they would go to their city home, which was often a townhouse in the heart of the city and would be more, several stories high. And the address of this was very important. So the address, just like today, there's some neighborhoods that are fancier than others. Having a house in the right part of town could make all the difference in your social life. So you would know it was time to leave your country home and head into the city when the season got started. Now, the season usually ran, the height of it was from about April to June, but it could start as early as January or February. And this is when Parliament came back into session and when the military was often on leave and would be back in town. And this was the time when people would throw these massive parties and parties all the time. And the number one thing that the season was really set up to do was to introduce the debutantes and to introduce eligible young men to eligible young women. It was actually considered that if you had been out in society for 2 to 3 seasons and were not yet married, that you were going to be a hopeless spinster and that something was desperately wrong with you. For most families, the most important season would be their daughter's first season. And this is when the young lady was considered ready to make her debut, and she'd be called a debutante. And if you're of the highest social class, you would be presented to the queen herself, seen over here, and otherwise you might just be presented to the other family and friends of your parents. And a girl was considered ready for debut when she had finished her education and when their parents felt that she was sort of socially and emotionally ready to be out in public. Basically, it was when you were ready to get married. Because the whole idea of being presented in society was to meet an eligible man that your family selected and to go ahead and get married. Married business had some things in it that we would recognize today, but marriages were still very much a matter of convenience in a lot of families, particularly at this level of wealth. So the parents would often arrange the marriage. The young men and women may or may not know about it until the father and mother had figured this out, and then the young man would do the traditional, I think, a proposal on his knee. So there's a moment in the importance of being earnest when the young couple gets engaged, and the mother comes in and tells the daughter, "You are not engaged. When you are engaged, I will tell you that you are engaged." So they're sort of waiting to hear from the parents' point of view and not for the couple to arrange things on their own as a love match. The young men from very wealthy families, when they weren't going to parties in the evening to be introduced to all of the eligible young women, would spend their time at very private, posh clubs where they would gamble and play cards and sort of drink a lot. They might take strolls through the city, or they might, in the countryside, spend a lot of their time hunting and on horseback. And on the other hand, had a lot less leisure time and were never allowed out without a chaperone. So anytime that they were out in public, and here you can see this couple over here sort of trying to be romantic, but they would always have the chaperone with them. Usually the chaperone was an elderly woman who was employed by the household specifically for the purpose of going around with the young women so that they could never have been seen to be alone with a young man. Just being alone with a young man could actually be grounds for the parents to insist on a marriage because the young woman's reputation would have been so heavily compromised by being seen without her chaperone. To the expected behavior for young women. Young women were expected to be quiet and serene. They were expected to learn how to manage the household and how to entertain guests and to be an excellent hostess. And that was pretty much about it. They'd be taught enough information. They would usually speak several languages and be able to be well um, conversationalists so they could keep everyone entertained, but they didn't really have a lot of opportunities to do much else besides that. So they would spend their time going and visiting each other and having tea, but above all, they were not supposed to lose their temper and they were not supposed to have a lot of opinions. They were supposed to smile and be pretty and to help entertain everyone around them. If you're from a very wealthy family, you would not attend a public school. You would have a private tutor. The girls would have private tutors for music and for languages and for some simple household mathematics because a young woman was expected to be able to manage her household, which often could include a number of servants, planning the meals, all that kinds of things. So they had to have an education, but they didn't go out into public school. And then the young men would have private tutors as well until they were old enough to go to the more prosperous universities. Children's lives from these wealthy families were ruled much more by their governesses than they were by their parents. The governess was usually either a very young woman who hadn't married yet, or usually from a poorer family, or perhaps would never marry, or was a very old woman who hadn't married or might be a widow from, again, from a lower class family. And they were sort of, in one way, kind of a glorified babysitter who would take care of the small children in the nursery. Sometimes the governesses would actually act as tutors as well and would teach them basic reading and things to the children. But the lady of the household would only see the children maybe first thing in the morning, and then they'd be brought to her during the dinner The children do not usually eat with the parents. They might have some time that they might have some snacks or some small meals together, but children would not have been present for those big fancy dinner parties. The governess was responsible for keeping them clean and neat and for teaching them all the discipline and manners and things that they would need. Convention of Victorian life that you will see kind of satirized in the importance of being earnest is this idea of grief and mourning. Now, the Victorians took grief and death very seriously. So, if someone close to you died, there were all of these very specific etiquette rules. Usually, you would not, the period of mourning, if you were a widow, would last up to 2 years. If it were someone like your parents or close to you, it might be up to a year. And during that time, you would wear all black for the first several months, and then gradually you could go to lighter colors. So you'd start with black and then go to gray, and then maybe go to like a mauve. It was called like a purplish lavender color, and then up into the lighter colors, and finally back into regular clothing. The women might wear this long veil. It was often known as dressing in crepe, which was this fabric that was kind of this crimped sort of look to it. And you wouldn't be seen out at parties and dancing and things, because that would be seen as disrespectful. That's the end. I hope that this glimpse into Victorian life gives you a little bit of a better understanding as we go forward with reading The Importance of Being Earnest.